Alexander Hamilton probably is now one of the more famous and best known founding fathers because of the play Hamilton, and which became like a huge rave hit. You know, I think it was Broadway. I think it played at the Kennedy Center. And like anybody who was anybody went to see Hamilton. That was kind of like your status symbol, you know, for a while there. If you hadn't been to see Hamilton, like, are you really anybody? So everybody, you know, became huge. Everybody became huge Alexander Hamilton fans. But people might be surprised if they open the book, open the Federalist Papers, and see some of the things that Hamilton believed, some of the things that he advocated for, because it's ironic that as adored as he is now because of this play, a lot of the things that he would advocate for are kind of on the fringe of what would be considered acceptable by a lot of people today.
Because no one likes too much power in the hands of a person that you don't like, right? So that's where, you know, every president. That's why every president.
I was just agreeing. That's a great point.
Every presidential election is extremely contentious, especially more so. It seems like it's kind of getting worse and worse and worse as time goes on, because in part the president does have a lot of executive power, which has grown over the years. So it didn't start out, and we'll get to this maybe in the third episode more, but it didn't start out as strong as it is now. It's grown over time, which is, again, foreshadowing. I think that's what that's what Madison was concerned about, is giving too much power to the executive. So, but at the same time, doing the research for this, I was heavily persuaded by the very persuasive words of Hamilton, because the points he makes are right on the money. Like, we have this decentralized, unaccountable groupthink, this conglomerate of people with just human nature and pride and all the things that you just laid out that Hamilton said are right on the money. So how do you direct the nation, push the nation in a direction when you don't have any one vision that the people can follow and that can be articulated? So far, Hamilton's persuaded me quite a bit with his words and his perspectives. Day, Fire for Effect fans. It is this is episode 30, and we're focusing today on kind of an expose of Alexander Hamilton, famous founding father. Today is February 12th. We're recording this, and the intent for this is going to be a 3-part series. So this part is focused on Alexander Hamilton. We'll talk about his role as a founding father overall, but also really focusing on something that kind of set him apart from some of the other founding fathers, and that is his idea of a strong executive branch of our government, which a lot of people don't know, and a lot of people associate the founding fathers in general for not believing that, and we'll compare and contrast his views in particular with part 2 with James Madison, who had a different perspective on that. So we got Marcus Moyer with us today. How's it going, Marcus?
It's going well, Jim. Good to see you again, man. Excited to talk about this.
Yeah. It's a good way to kind of compare some different perspectives and highlight some threads of thought that just to point out that the founders were not all synonymous on every single aspect, which is why, and partly why, there was the Federalist Papers that Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote. And even within the Federalist Papers, there was some disagreement on some of these things. And also, of course, at the Constitutional Convention was very contentious, a lot of arguing back and forth, a lot of compromise. So this is an example of that. And part three, the intention for part three of this three-part series is after we focus on Alexander Hamilton, some of his perspectives, James Madison and his perspectives, some similar, some different. The third one will be really to kind of tease apart what those differences are and talk about how that plays into our government today in America and really in the world, just different governing philosophies and how that's kind of playing out today. And of course, we'll kind of bring up probably some parallels in the first two episodes as well. So let's do a quick introduction here on Alexander Hamilton and kind of the overall arc of his story in the American founding. He was born in the West Indies around 1755 to 1757 and rose from very humble origins to become a key architect of American independence and governance. His impact during the Revolutionary era and the subsequent formation of the federal government was profound, marked by his intellectual prowess, very intelligent guy, very articulate, his advocacy for centralized authority, and practical contributions to military and fiscal policy. His vision emphasized a strong national government to unify the fledgling states and countering the decentralizing tendencies of the Articles of Confederation, which was widely seen at that point as being too weak to get America up on its feet. One of Hamilton's most enduring contributions was, of course, the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays published between 1787 and 1788 to promote the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. He collaborated with James Madison, which will be the focus of episode number, the second part of part two of our series, and John Jay. Hamilton authored the majority, 51 essays, under the pseudonym Publius. The three of them collectively were known as Publius. His writings eloquently defended the proposed Constitution structure, particularly its balance of powers. In essays like Federalist number 70, which we'll talk about a lot, I think, in this episode, he argued for an energetic executive. While numbers 78 to 83, he outlined the judiciary's role in checking legislative overreach. The Federalist Papers not only swayed public opinion during ratification debates, but also remain a cornerstone for interpreting the Constitution today, influencing Supreme Court decisions throughout America's history. Hamilton's persuasive style and logical rigor helped bridge divides among skeptics, ensuring the document's adoption in key states like New York. And then his service to George Washington was also legendary. So, of course, there's the famous play Hamilton. I think it's just called Hamilton. Is that right? Yeah, the play Hamilton, famous about 6 years ago or so. Really portrayed his relationship with George Washington in both wartime and peacetime. During the Revolutionary War, he served as Washington's aide-de-camp from 1777 to 1781, earning General Washington's trust through his administrative skills and strategic insights. He drafted correspondence, coordinated logistics, and even led an assault at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. So he wasn't just a staff weenie. He was actually out there also leading the charge.
Stacking bodies. Yeah.
That's right. Which helped secure victory over the British. After the war, Washington appointed Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury in 1789, a position where Hamilton implemented bold economic reforms, established the national bank, assumed state debts to foster federal credit, and promoted manufacturing through tariffs. Ooh, tariffs. That's a topic ripe today. Yeah. Policies that stabilized the economy and laid the groundwork for America's financial system. Washington's reliance on Hamilton underscored his role as a de facto prime minister in the early cabinet, advising on foreign affairs and domestic policy amid partisan tensions. So, just end the introduction with this, because this is kind of the reason why we're bringing this up. Central to Hamilton's philosophy was his advocacy for a strong executive branch, which he believed essential for effective governance and national unity. And we'll pull the thread on Federalist number 70 a little bit later on. And he did contrast sharply with James Madison. Even though they wrote the Federalist Papers together, they had some sharp contrasts in some of their perspectives on how the young American government should operate. Of course, he died tragically in a famous duel with Aaron Burr in 1804, which cut his contributions short prematurely. A couple of other things that he did that I just found out in the research was he started the Treasury Department, or founded it, and the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, which I didn't know. So he had a profound impact on the founding of America. His legacy, of course, lives on today. But it does paint a contrast between different perspectives that still are argued today amongst the left and the right, Democrats, Republicans, libertarians, all argue frequently, whether they kind of know it or not. One of the central points of contention is how strong the executive branch of our government should be in relation to the other branches of government. So that's an introduction. Marcus, take it away.
Man, you said a lot in that introduction, and like my mind is spinning. So many of the things that you said, I'm already like chasing rabbits, in my mind. So many ways you could go with this conversation. For example, you mentioned that he died. Alexander Hamilton died in this duel with the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr, who is another. I think people know the name simply because he was involved in this duel in which he killed Alexander Hamilton. But very interesting if you study what happened to him after that. And I really knew nothing about him until a couple years ago. I read a book by David McCullough. I think the name of the book was The Settlers. So David McCullough, the same guy who wrote 1776, John Adams and all of that. His book, The Settlers, there's a part in there about Aaron Burr on what happened to him after the duel. And like, it's not what we're here to talk about today, but man, that's a fascinating story. I like the fact that we're talking about Alexander Hamilton and James Madison for a number of reasons. You alluded in your opening there that they were co-authors of the Federalist Papers along with John Jay, all of whom wrote the Federalist Papers under the pseudonym Publius, which is, if you've watched Fire for Effect for any amount of time, you've probably heard us reference an article that Jim wrote a while back called Exhuming Publius. Point being that what these three authors did in the Federalist Papers under that pseudonym was explain and defend the Constitution and the principles that are therein, trying to get the rest of the country through the ratification process and helping them understand why it's written the way it is, the importance of the principles that are outlined there, and why they make sense. And as you said, Jim, they didn't, even those three authors didn't always agree, as we'll demonstrate here in the next, over the next 2 or 3 episodes, that Alexander Hamilton and James Madison did not necessarily see eye to eye on how these things were to be carried out. But they were both instrumental architects in this. And Alexander Hamilton probably is now one of the more famous and best known founding fathers because of the play that you mentioned, Hamilton, and which became like a huge rave hit. I think it was Broadway. I think it played at the Kennedy Center. And like anybody who was anybody went to see Hamilton. That was kind of like your status symbol, for a while there. If you hadn't been to see Hamilton, like, are you really anybody?
You live
So
under a
everybody,
rock? Yeah.
became huge Yeah, exactly. Everybody became huge Alexander Hamilton fans, and I guess I'm not anybody because I didn't go to see the play. But I think it's I think people might be surprised if they open the Federalist Papers and see some of the things that Hamilton believed, some of the things that he advocated for, because it's ironic that as adored as he is now because of this play, a lot of the things that he would advocate for are kind of on the fringe of what would be considered acceptable by a lot of people today. One of those being, and this changes from administration to administration because that's how politics works. But one of those controversial things that he was a strong advocate for that some people today might raise their eyebrows at is the strong executive. He believed that not having a strong executive was the equivalent of being a bad government. You can't have a good government with a weak executive, he would say, and therefore he argued for a very strong single executive at the as president. And of course, whether you're talking about the current administration or the last one or even the one before that, there are a ton of people who would say that that's actually dangerous to our democracy, that it's a threat to our democracy, having so much power consolidated in a single individual. And we won't even breach the fact that we don't actually live in a democracy, but that's what the complaint is, right? So I think it's going to be really cool and exciting to talk about these two guys, to learn more about what their political philosophies were and the things that they advocated for. No argument they were both brilliant. They were allies in some ways. They were rivals in others. As we mentioned, co-authors of the Constitution's defense. But together, they really did help design the framework of the American government as we know it today, even though they disagreed sometimes about how the government should function. But you can look around at the United States government today, and you can see bits and pieces of what they both advocated for. In this opening episode of this 3-part series, we're going to focus on Hamilton, as you said, a soldier, a financial architect, constitutional strategist, and without a doubt, one of the most influential political thinkers in American history. You mentioned his record on the battlefield during the Revolutionary War, and then, of course, his prolific writing afterward as part of the Federalist Papers. He believed that in order to build a strong and durable, respected national government that was capable of securing liberty, not just in theory but in practice, that certain things were necessary and there were questions that had to be answered. And his vision of what that should look like definitely came with a lot of controversy, hence his need to defend it on paper. The questions that they were trying to ask and answer were, how strong should the central government be? Because there's clearly a lot of angst at the time about centralized power. They felt like they had just escaped that. They just fought a war over centralized power. So who's this guy telling me now that, I'm basically just trading one tyrant for another? He had to argue his way out of that. How much power should be concentrated in the executive? And what role should finance, commerce, and national credit play in shaping the republic? Like his concept of the benefit of debt, for example, would have been counterintuitive to a lot of people of that day. And as a matter of fact, it's probably counterintuitive to a lot of people today. But he had some things to say about that. And these were the questions that defined Hamilton's life and ignited some of the most consequential debates of his time and ours, for that matter. We may not often recognize that we're still arguing about some of Hamilton's principles, but we are. And so today we want to focus on Alexander Hamilton, his life, his writings, his governing philosophy that helped shape the institutions of America that we still live under more than 2 centuries later. So I would say it's impossible to understand the American system and form of government if you don't understand Alexander Hamilton.
100%. And I think Hamilton and Madison together helps kind of encompass the two collectively, kind of the overall views of the founders, including some of their disagreements. And again, that's kind of why we're focused on those two in particular. John Jay, also co-author of the Federalist Papers, didn't write many of the Federalist Papers, so Hamilton and Madison wrote a preponderance of them overwhelmingly. They again, and I want to stress they agreed with each other overwhelmingly, but had a very distinct difference in opinion on this topic of the power of the executive. So I'm going to read.
John Jay seemed.
Does he have something?
John Jay seemed to
Go
be
ahead.
that. Yeah, John Jay seemed to be that guy, that third party in the school project who gets credit for it, but he didn't contribute near as much as the other two. And then he went on to be on the Supreme Court, so he came away probably more unscathed than the other two.
That's true.
But anyway, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
First Supreme Court justice. That's right. Chief Justice, I believe. Very influential in some of his initial rulings, and he was one of the guys that we quoted in some previous episodes talking about the Christian founding of America. He very, very openly
very strong views.
Stressed that in some of his judicial philosophy. So I wanted I'm just going to, read. I have 6 kind of takeaways, quotes from Federalist number 70, where Hamilton really stressed his perspective on the need for a strong executive. I'll read a couple and I'll just pause and see if you want to jump in with anything to add to it. And we'll just kind of keep talking about Federalist number 70. Once we talk about the Federalist Papers as a whole and whatever other ones you want to talk about, because I know there's somebody talks about the purpose of a strong judiciary or a judiciary that's held accountable. Some of his other papers were about that. I'll get into, or we can get into what his influences were, why, like what influenced him to make these conclusions about these things. So first quote from Federalist number 70, he says that there is an idea which is not without its advocates that a vigorous executive is inconsistent with the genius of a republican government. And you, Marcus, pointed out that some of the arguments that are out there today always talk about a democracy, threat to democracy or against the democracy or whatever. But as he points out right here, it mentions that it's a republican government. And the founders never once, I don't believe, in the Federalist Papers or the Constitution is the word democracy even mentioned, if I'm not mistaken.
It's mentioned, but never in a favorable light. They were dead set against democracies.
Right. So, and then he also says, energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. That's one of his most quoted lines. So he's not being around the bush. He also wrote, "It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assault of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy." A lot in that quote right there, but that really reveals some of his reasons for why he believes in a strong executive. So I'll pause there and just a little bit want to hear your thoughts going into this paper.
Yeah, going back to what I said in the opening about how he viewed, if you don't have a strong executive, you don't have a good government. Period. That was his philosophy. in the opening paragraphs of Federalist number 70, he said again and again, not beating around the bush. He said there can be no need, however, to multiply arguments or examples on this head, this idea of needing a strong executive. He said a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for bad execution. And a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. So he came out of the gate swinging, saying that you don't even have a government if you don't have a strong executive, and if you water it down with some form of a council or dual headship, you don't have a good government. And he provides a bunch of examples of how that didn't work well in history. Rome being an example. And then, as you mentioned, he was emphatic that a strong executive needed what he called energy. And then he defined that. He said the ingredients that constitute energy in the executive are, first, unity, meaning one person. Secondly, duration. Thirdly, an adequate provision for its support. And fourthly, competent powers. And then he goes on. I think he wrote an individual paper for each one of those things that he was advocating for. So starting in Federalist 70, and if you read the next several Federalist Papers, he expounds on each of those things that are necessary for a strong, energetic executive. The first being unity, meaning it needs to be consolidated in a single individual, not a shared responsibility. And one of the first things he pointed to, he didn't start by going back and explaining how, the history of the Roman Empire having its two praetors, how that didn't end well for Rome. He started with examples of his own state, New York, and I believe the other one was New Jersey. And I didn't realize this at the time, but he wrote here, again, in the opening of Federalist 70, he said, we find examples in the Constitution of several of the states. New York and New Jersey, if I recollect right, are the only states which have entrusted the executive authority wholly to single men. So actually I had that backward. Those were the only two states who actually had unity in the executive. He said both these methods of destroying the unity of the executive have their partisans, but the votaries of an executive council are the most numerous. They are both liable, if not equal, to similar objections and may in most lights be examined in conjunction. So I didn't realize that the majority of the states at the time didn't have a single executive over the state. Apparently they were ruled by council, or at least more than one person. And he goes on to explain and describe why that system doesn't work well. Before we get into his views on councils, what are your thoughts on all of that we just laid out?
Yeah, I didn't know that either. I didn't know that different states had different levels of executive structure, which is interesting. Because now, like, we're used to, every state, of course, has a governor, which is a good point in itself, because clearly, if they didn't all start out that way, but over time, they've all became,
they were persuaded by Hamilton, apparently.
Right. Yeah. Or through trial and error, just kind of realizing, it's just too unwieldy to not have an executive, I guess, of the state. And you and I talked about this offline. Just, it's interesting to see how different counties look at that as well. So there's different counties and cities and towns that have different levels of, like some counties don't have a chief executive or a strong form of government, and just have the county council district members with equal power and kind of no one over them. They might hire a manager or an administrator, but the county council members are co-equal, and kind of run the government more or less with their ordinances and policies and votes and everything, and versus a chief executive model. There's other terms for that, but where you have a person in charge of a person that is elected by the people to to run the county and still has county council members underneath them. And very similar with towns and cities. Usually the bigger cities will have a strong form of mayoral government. Some will have a weak form of mayoral government. These are terms you can Google afterwards, but it just, so the experiment still happens throughout the country at different levels of government, but at the state level, every state has a governor, and that does kind of corroborate a lot of what, and I guess the reasons why. I'll just kind of just guess here a little bit, and Hamilton mentioned it, and just to put it in my own words, when you have a body of people in charge of a government, or really an institution or a company or whatever, and you don't have a single person in charge and responsible and accountable, groupthink tends to get in the way of efficient management, because when you don't have any one person accountable, then nobody's accountable, more or less, or the accountability is it's decentralized so much that everyone blames the other person for how they voted or didn't vote or whatever. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the people to hold, a body like that accountable. So having one person kind of leading, setting the agenda and the direction, and having, hiring, firing capabilities and a lot of say over the budget, was still being influenced and kept in check by a lower body, so to speak, of, council members or whatever. But still having to, as that top person, campaign, share with sell to the public that person's qualifications, experience, make that person available to the media. It's one of the really important reasons for free speech in the First Amendment, is for the media to hold elected officials accountable. When you don't have one person at the top to be able to be held accountable, it's very difficult to move in a direction that is efficient and I don't know. It doesn't succumb to groupthink, I guess, which can lead to a lot of inefficiencies. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Groupthink and diffusion of responsibility are the two things that you just laid out there. And to your last point, Hamilton addressed that exact thing toward the end of Federalist number 70, where he said, in a republic where every magistrate ought to be personally responsible for his behavior in office, the reason which in the British Constitution dictates the propriety of a council not only ceases to apply, but turns against the institution. And the diffusion of responsibility that you were describing in a council or a board of supervisors, as the case might be here where I live in Prince William County, it's really kind of unfair to the public, or can be, as well as to the elected representative that sits on that council. Because in Prince William County, for example, we're divided up into 7 magisterial districts, and each one of those districts has a supervisor that sits on the board of supervisors, and then there is one chair at large, an 8th seat on that council. But if you live in Prince William County and there's something that you wish the council would do and they don't, the only thing you can do is vote against your supervisor, which is 1/8 of the voting body.
Exactly.
In the next election, which may or may not make a difference. There are a handful of townships and cities in Prince William County that still have a mayor. And I think it would be very interesting, maybe just within a single state, to look at the various counties and townships and see which ones have a single executive authority, a mayor, as opposed to those who have a town council or a board of supervisors. And I don't know what metrics you would use in order to determine which one of those is working better in that state, but it would be a very interesting study, I think. Hamilton wrote You mentioned earlier that we'll get into like what influenced his opinions, where he got these philosophies from. But as the founding fathers did all the time, they weren't making these judgments and decisions or coming to these conclusions in a vacuum. They were immensely well read, and they had studied history ad nauseum. And he mentioned, Hamilton did. He said the experience of other nations will afford little instruction on this head, and in other words, this idea of a strong executive. He said, as far, however, as it teaches us anything, it teaches us not to be enamored of plurality in the executive. In other words, we shouldn't be impressed. We won't be impressed with the instances that we find where there was not a single strong executive. He said, we have seen that the Achaeans, on the experiment of two praetors, were induced to abolish one. The Roman history records many instances of mischiefs to the republic from the dissensions between the consuls and between the military tribunes, who were at times substituted for consuls. But it gives us no specimens of any peculiar advantages derived to the state from the circumstances of the plurality of those magistrates. So at least in the argument that he's making here, he says he doesn't see any example in history where there has been an advantage to having a plurality, in other words, a dual headship in the executive. Also, the dangers that he tried to outline regarding diluting the executive by having too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will. Fact that there's a danger in that arrangement, just based solely on human nature, where people either want to take credit for a thing or they want to avoid responsibility for a thing, and if they can't be the captain of the ship, they would rather see it sink, kind of a thing. He said that regarding councils, he said men often oppose a thing merely because they have no agency in planning it, or because they have been it may have been planned by those whom they dislike. And we see this principle borne out all the time in Congress, which is the legislative branch, not the executive. But can you imagine the detriment that it would be if the executive branch were plagued by the same sorts of challenges that we see in the legislative branch? Legislative branch doesn't have to act quickly. Sometimes the executive does. And so you could see where that sort of arrangement might be acceptable in the legislative branch, but not so much in the executive. Hamilton goes on to say, so just to reiterate there, he said, men often oppose a thing merely because they have had no agency in planning it, or because it may have been planned by those whom they dislike. But if they have been consulted and have happened to disapprove, opposition then becomes, in their estimation, an indispensable duty of self-love. They seem to think themselves bound in honor and by all the motives of personal infallibility to defeat the success of what has been resolved upon contrary to their sentiments. Men of upright, benevolent tempers have too many opportunities of remarking with horror to what desperate lengths this disposition is sometimes carried, and how often the great interests of society are sacrificed to the vanity, to the conceit, and to the obstinacy of individuals who have credit enough to make their passions and their caprices interesting to mankind. He said, perhaps the question now before the public may, in its consequences, afford melancholy proofs of the effects of this despicable frailty, or rather detestable vice, in the human character. I actually love the way Hamilton writes. I think it's very poetic, and it's very eloquent, maybe a little bit out of fashion in today's world. But if you can take the time to read a paragraph like that, and if you're like me, you'll probably have to read it 2 or 3 times for it to land. But if you can grasp what he's saying here, it makes a whole lot of sense. He's basically describing Congress and saying you don't want that in your executive. And I think he's probably right.
Yeah, that he's very keen on human nature. That's very true.
Yeah.
And it goes into, it made me think of just a leadership kind of quote principle or tactic, I guess. Like if as a leader and if you want to make change in your organization, is very helpful to instead of just dictating, all right, now we're going to forget what we've been doing the last 10 years. Now we're going to do this and you're going to do what I say. That doesn't work as well as let's meet and talk together and get buy-in from everybody about what direction we're going to go. And even if you kind of steer them towards what you wanted to do anyway, as long as they have buy-in into the process and it becomes part of their solution, then they're more likely to support it. And that's very true. Basically, the founders were really knowledgeable on, biblical principles and the idea of pride being one of the biggest sins, if not the biggest sin, the source of all sin. You could probably chalk up as to being pride. And he was very well aware of that, as were the other founders, and was keen on recognizing that that paragraph described, what he wrote, is that there'll be some members of a body or a council, whatever, that'll vote against something because it wasn't their idea, even if they know this thing is going to be beneficial for whatever organization or the community, or it's the best compromise you can come up with. They'll still, not support it, just out of pride.
Yeah.
And again, yeah, so that makes sense.
Yeah. So he laid that out as one reason why it's not a good idea to have the executive vested in the hands of multiple people, simply because of the human nature of making it more difficult to get things done, because of people either seeking credit or wanting to avoid making somebody they disagree with look good.
Right.
The other thing that you were talking about, Jim, is this diffusion of responsibility where things aren't getting done, but there's no one person to blame for it, and there's enough diffusion of responsibility that they can all point at each other and blame each other, and no one's held responsible. Hamilton described that, saying that an executive that is beholden to a council, it's very easy for that individual to say, well, I was overruled by my council. The council were so divided in their opinions that it was impossible to obtain any better resolution to the point. And he said these and similar pretexts are constantly at hand, whether true or false. And who is there that will either take the trouble or incur the odium of a strict scrutiny into the secret springs of that transaction? Should there be found a citizen zealous enough to undertake the unpromising task, if there happen to be collusion between the parties concerned, how easy it is to clothe the circumstances with so much ambiguity as to render it uncertain what was the precise conduct of any of those parties. It's very, very profound insight, I think. And then he goes on to say that sometimes that is not that's a feature, not a bug, in some arrangements. He said in the single instance in which the governor of this state, I think he's talking about New York, is coupled with a council, that is the appointment to offices, which we have seen the mischiefs of it in the view now under consideration. Scandalous appointments to important offices have been made. Some cases, indeed, have been so flagrant that all parties, and he did that in all caps, all parties have agreed in the impropriety of the thing. When inquiry has been made, the blame has been laid by the governor on the members of the council, who on their part have charged it upon his nomination, while the people remain altogether at a loss to determine by whose influences their interests have been committed to hands so unqualified and so manifestly improper. In tenderness to individuals, I forbear to descend to particulars, he said. So he's describing that whether by intent or by accident, how councils, yeah. So I think he makes a pretty compelling case that, at least in the executive branch, it should be vested in the hands of a single individual, not diluted into a council.
Yeah, and I gotta admit, as I was researching for this episode, my biases were in uh, uh, the other direction. Because I'm a big or decentralized, government mindset, and not too much power in the executive, um, and big believer in the 10th Amendment, where the states are supposed to have a lot more independence from the federal government if it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, things like that. Because no one likes too much power in the hands of a person that you don't like, right? So that's where
Good point.
every
Good
president.
point.
That's why go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing. That's a great point.
Every presidential election is extremely contentious, especially more so. It seems like it's kind of getting worse and worse and worse as time goes on, because in part the president does have a lot of executive power, which has grown over the years. So it didn't start out, and we'll get to this maybe in the third episode more, but it didn't start out as strong as it is now. It's grown over time, which is again foreshadowing. I think that's what Madison was concerned about, is giving too much power to the executive. So, but at the same time, doing the research for this, I was heavily persuaded by the very persuasive words of Hamilton, because the points he makes are right on the money. Like, when you have this decentralized, unaccountable groupthink, this conglomerate of people with just human nature and pride and all the things that you just laid out that Hamilton said are right on the money. So how do you direct the nation, push the nation in a direction when you don't have any one vision that the people can follow and that can be articulated? So far, Hamilton's persuaded me quite a bit with his words and his perspectives.
You do bring up an interesting point, though, about the abuse of power consolidated in the hands of one man, and Hamilton did not ignore that. He addressed that as well. Remember, we said he laid out those principles that define a strong executive, first of which was unity, which is putting it in the hands of a single person. The very next principle, though, is duration. And his view was that it needs to be limited for exactly the reasons you described, is that because there's so much potential for abuse, when one man has too much power, he can't be allowed to have it for too long. He did end, and he talks about that in Federalist 71, but he ended Federalist 70 by, with a flourish, finishing his point that he just very eloquently made. He said, "When power, therefore, is placed in the hands of so small a number of men, meaning a council, as to admit of their interests and views being easily combined in a common enterprise by an artful leader, it becomes more liable to abuse and more dangerous when abused than if it be lodged in the hands of one man, who from the very circumstance of his being alone will be more narrowly watched and more readily suspected, and who cannot unite so great a mass of influence as when he is associated with others." And then at the very end, he kind of appeals to the credibility of the masses when he says that, I'll add that prior to the appearance of the Constitution, I rarely met with an intelligent man from any of the states who did not admit, as a result of experience, that the unity, the singularity of the executive of this state was one of the best of the distinguishing features of our Constitution. So he didn't say every man that he met. He said every intelligent man that he met had that view. And so maybe it was kind of a subtle psychological game he's playing with his audience. If you're intelligent, you're going to agree with me.
Yeah. One of the things that we know the founders read a lot of Greek history, the Roman Republic, all that. Yeah. So that we know that was an influence on the founders and on Hamilton. So it ties right into what you're saying and some of the things that you quoted him saying, because he noted that the Roman Republic often resorted to absolute this is his word, Hamilton's words, absolute power of a single man under the formidable title of dictator to handle threats from ambitious individuals, seditions. So, and in that longer quote I read a while ago from 70, let's pull that thread a little bit. So I'll read that again. So this is from Hamilton, Federalist Papers number 70. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. That's a very important point. And then he goes on to, it is not less essential for the steady administration of the laws. So we kind of talked about that a little bit, the steady administration of the laws, the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice. Very flowery way to put that. To the security of liberty against the enterprises and ambitions of ambition, faction, and of anarchy. So he's talking about national security in many different ways there. The first being from a foreign attack. And, that comes up, again, it's come up recently when the Trump administration did the attack on Iran, when they invaded Venezuela and captured Maduro. You hear in Congress right off the bat, the president doesn't have the power to do this. The president, the Congress needs to declare war. And you and I have heard that our whole lives, when the reality is the U.S. Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. So the Iraq war that went on for the second time around went on for 20 years. The first Iraq invasion in 1991. Under the first George W. Bush, or the George H.W. Bush, followed by the second one under George W. Bush. It went on for 20 years. Invasion of Afghanistan. I mean, you name it. We have not declared war for any of those things. So in a lot of cases, the president did try to get consensus from the people and from Congress and sometimes the United Nations, but not one time since World War II has Congress declared war, which is supposed to be a way to, well, I guess if it took declaring war for any of those things to happen, and you can be really, there's a lot of strong arguments for and against, some of those military engagements that I mentioned, especially in hindsight. It's very easy in hindsight to say that George W. Bush invading Iraq a second time was not wise because it was under the conditions of supposed weapons of mass destruction and all that stuff, which was never fully proven. So a lot of people think it was under false pretenses. But it did have overwhelming support at the time. But the point being, if it took for all those actions and many more, many smaller ones, under Reagan, invaded Grenada, if I'm not mistaken. If it took for Congress to declare war to allow a president to act in foreign affairs militarily, now that I'm saying this out loud, some people may be just perfectly happy with that. Some people may be perfectly happy with the U.S. getting less involved, especially these days. It's become a much more prominent position, especially in conservative circles. It used to be more of a prominent position in the Democrat side for decades. And it seems to kind of flipped recently in recent times, where a lot more conservatives, Tucker Carlson, those kind of folks, against foreign interventions. But Hamilton's point is, if America faced a direct threat on our national sovereignty, he did not believe, and I think I agree with him, that the President of the United States should not have to wait for Congress to declare war before acting either reactively, obviously, but even more important and with more nuance and complexity, proactively ahead of time, before the attack happens, before a perceived attack happens. And, that was the rationale of George W. Bush invading Iraq. It was, Saddam hadn't attacked the United States homeland, but there was concerns that he might with, nuclear weapon of some kind or attack our interests overseas. So that was one of the main points why Hamilton, in addition to the things we talked about earlier, just for the efficiency of running the government domestically, but also protecting the American people, which a lot of people say is the president's number one priority, is protecting the American people. And if that president doesn't have the power to do that without having to consult Congress, then you're tying in his or her hands pretty significantly.
Yeah, that was the rationale behind the strikes in Iran recently as well. And you're right. Like I don't know that anybody really argues against the president's authority to respond to an active threat, after the fact in defense of the homeland. Where it starts to get murky is when that initial self-defense response turns into a 20-year occupation of another country, without Congress declaring it to be a war. Or maybe even more complicated is the preemptive strikes, like we were just talking about, especially if those preemptive strikes result in a full-blown war. I know you're right that Congress hasn't declared war as it's outlined in the Constitution since World War II, but all of those conflicts that you mentioned, whether it was Vietnam, Korea, Grenada, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf War, choose your conflict. We haven't, by the cleanest definition, we haven't successfully won any of those conflicts. And they've been a source of contention, both when they were ongoing, Vietnam probably being the most famous, and then afterward, they've been a sore spot, kind of an open wound that gets ripped open and salt poured into it every now and then, for political conflicts and debates that we have with each other. And I wonder if maybe our inability to win, by the traditional definition, and the fact that those remain political bludgeons, indefinitely, if that's not a result of the fact that we didn't really do it the right way. If it was something that the country as a whole had gone into in some sort of unified fashion, and on the record of being unified because our elected representatives voted for it, then we can't really use it against each other. I mean, we can still say it was a bad decision, but we can't say that it wasn't partially ours,
Yeah.
And I don't know, thought.
Yeah,
Definitely
that's
caused
true.
a lot of division.
Yeah, and I wonder, thinking back on all those examples you mentioned, if the president at the time for all those conflicts, if they didn't consult Congress to ask them to declare war because they feared that the Congress may not, partially maybe for those reasons you laid out, that we've kind of in recent times gained a history. We've been resting on World War II's laurels since the end of World War II. There's a decisive victory and American strength, all that stuff, and we haven't had that since. And that's over time has led to maybe a lot of it definitely has led to a growing movement, like I mentioned, against foreign interventions because of exactly what you just laid out. That it hasn't gone well in the long run. You could argue. You're going to say something.
I think, and Hamilton didn't mention this, but as we've talked about it, I've thought about it. A danger of having power vested in a single executive and having a diffusion of power in the legislative branch. Another potential danger that I think these instances bear out, and we also saw it during COVID, is that the elected legislators are quite content to let the executive stick its neck out without their approval or their disapproval, for that matter, because even though they might support it, or maybe they're against it, they don't want to go on record for it. And by sitting back and just letting the executive do things by emergency power, or through, in this case that we've been talking about, a president getting involved in a conflict that they may or may not support, since the outcome is always uncertain in the future, legislators seem content to let executives kind of run amok when they could and probably should put some restraint on them as a check and a balance that they're supposed to be. but it's easy to let that single point of leadership take the fall if things go sideways.
True. It's very true. And in that light, it's, I guess, worth giving some kudos to presidents for having the courage to make those decisions, even if they didn't turn out well, and even if you don't agree with any one of those particular conflicts, knowing that they made the decision, knowing that the burden would fall on their decision, one person, instead of dispersing it across the Congress. And even though Congress, like the Iraq War being a great example, even though Congress didn't declare war formally, it was debated heavily in Congress, and a lot of representatives and senators did take vocal positions, either support or against the war, and that has come back to bite them years later. Even though they didn't formally declare war, they still, in front of Congress, in front of the media, took different votes here and there and spoke on the floor, and that's come back to bite a lot of them, especially those that were for the Iraq War at the time, which was, I think, overwhelming, were for it. Numbers of Congress, men and women, were for it, but has since, as you pointed out, a 20-year drug-out conflict with a lot of unfortunate deaths and, leading to the spawning of ISIS and just problems around the Middle East that are still playing out today. The American populace and a lot of the same Congressmen and women, most of them out of Congress now, have now turned against it, turned against the idea of how that conflict was conducted. Anyway, point being,
I wonder how much of that. I'm sorry, finish. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying. Point being that the president's making the decision to get into these conflicts. The overwhelming amount of burden does fall on their shoulders because Congress is not declaring war. You can't say, well, Congress approved it. No, it's on the president. So just a heavy responsibility, I guess, is what I'm pointing out, not knowing how it's going to turn out.
I wonder how much of that behavior by congressmen or by our legislators, as well as our presidents, I wonder how much of that can be attributed to what we talked about several weeks ago, to the change in the way the courts viewed our Constitution as no longer being a legal document, but being a living organism, a living contract, or a living document, a living Constitution, right? Because it's interesting. You said that we've already said that the last time we actually declared war the way the Constitution says was World War II, following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And we recall a couple of weeks ago that the inflection point that we identified, at least, in the way that the courts viewed the Constitution was in 1947. And I wonder if that change in the way we viewed strict adherence to the original text of the Constitution, if that had anything to do with why presidents all of a sudden thought that they could just get involved in these conflicts and they didn't need Congress, why Congress allowed the presidents to do it, or at least found an excuse to allow them to, and the courts did nothing to challenge the constitutionality of it either.
It's an interesting point. So 1947 was an inflection point. Remind me again why that is.
That was the court case that we talked about when we were talking about separation of church and state, when the court started to revise its view on the protections of religious liberty. But that same philosophy, that evolutionary view of the Constitution, no reason it should have stopped with the First Amendment.
Right.
I mean, if you're going to open the Constitution up to reinterpretation, squeezing additional meaning out of the text, as Jefferson said, why could that not also apply to the executive's war powers?
Yeah, you're right. That was episode 28, I believe, where we talked about that.
I think so. 27, 28. Yeah.
27, 28. That's a good point.
I hadn't
Yeah, I
thought of
think
that before, but
nah,
maybe
I hadn't
it's
either.
connected.
Yeah. And I think in that episode, I had kind of the epiphany too that, you know, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president for going on 4 terms, and of course after that, to pass a constitutional amendment to limit the president to 2 terms, which is ironic because you mentioned earlier how Hamilton said that the length of a president's term is a way to check the strength of the executive. Yet there was no limit on the presidential number of terms a president could have until after World War II. Um, but what I was going to say was that under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a president for uh, over 12 years, he was able to appoint a lot of justices to the Supreme Court that were a little bit more left-leaning, I think, than average, which shifted the court to the left a little bit. So that also might have something to do with what you're saying about how the Constitution was interpreted, and it kind of became more of a living document kind of a thing.
Yeah, and Hamilton actually mentioned, he obviously addressed, the need to have a limited duration in the office of the executive, and he actually even mentioned 4 years. But he said it can't be confirmed or affirmed that the duration of 4 years or any other limited duration would completely answer the end proposed. He threw that out there as a suggestion. Maybe it should just be limited to 4 years. I mean, eventually we ended up following President Washington's example of 2 terms of 4 years each. But he was pretty adamant that there needed to be a limited duration. In the opening paragraph of Federalist 71, Hamilton said, it's a general principle of human nature that a man will be interested in whatever he possesses, in proportion to the firmness or precariousness of the tenure by which he holds it. Will be less attached to what he holds by a momentary or uncertain title than to what he enjoys by a durable or certain title, and of course will be willing to risk more for the sake of one than for the sake of the other. And so, basically what you were saying before, a president that he knows he's limited to 2 terms at most. If he's going to do something devious, how much is he really willing to risk for something that he's only going to be able to propagate for a handful of years? And even if he were successful in propagating it for a certain number of years, it can quickly be undone in the next administration. So that was Hamilton's acknowledgement of, I firmly believe it needs to be vested in the hands of a single person, but I also recognize the danger in that, and therefore it needs to be limited to 4 years or some other limit that we come up with.
Yeah. And looking to more, we mentioned earlier at the opening, some of the other influences on the founding fathers. We mentioned, ancient influences from Rome and Greece, but also at their time and in the founders' time, modern influences like John Locke and Montesquieu, David Hume, which I want to tie in more on episode 3 once we kind of combine and contrast Hamilton and Madison's views and kind of bring in these modern influences. But again, doing the research, I was surprised because, I think of John Locke and Montesquieu and David Hume as being the influence behind the idea of decentralized government. Locke in particular talked about the idea of rights, property rights, starting with the individual and moving out to what that individual creates and builds and acquires over time, leading to property rights. But all starts with the individual and the freedom of the individual and liberty of the individual. So I was surprised to see that despite that view, which I do believe Hamilton also held that view as well, but that John Locke was probably one of the influences of how Hamilton crafted his view of the strong executive. Because in the Two Treatises of Government, John Locke's famous essay or book in 1689, Locke wrote on executive prerogative, which is the power to act swiftly in emergencies without legislative approval, which aligned with Hamilton's emphasis on energy and decisiveness. So clearly, well, not clearly, but I think clearly that Locke was an influence as well, in that Hamilton having that mentality. Montesquieu wrote in The Spirit of Laws, 1748, advocated for separation of powers, but warned against weak or divided executives leading to inefficiency. Hamilton adapted this to argue for a unified executive with sufficient competent powers to ensure effective governance. And also David Hume. Hume's skepticism and emphasis on executive administration, including strong leadership, influenced Hamilton's realism about human nature, which you stressed earlier, and the need for energetic government to counter factions and ambition. So again, unexpected sources that I did not think would hold those views. Which again has just researching this has helped me kind of think differently about this topic and this perspective.
They cast a really wide net in what they referenced to inform their views and their philosophies and what they eventually, put down as policy. I'm impressed and they were not old guys either. They were young.
No.
But they were just extremely smart and articulate and well read.
Yeah, you think about,
and I think
Hamilton was born 5 time frame, 55, 57. I'm not sure, but we were declared Declaration of Independence July 1776. So we're talking, he was less than 20 years old at that point, or around 20 years old, which is just stunning. The amount of wisdom and intellect and
look at your average 20-year-old now
at that age is just no, yeah, it's incredible. Yep.
I think, and they weren't vain about it either. I think John Adams, when they were contemplating the Declaration of Independence, the idea of separating from Great Britain and the immense task that they knew it would be to establish a new country, to a new nation of laws, coming up with their own form of government. Like they were not ignorant of the monumental thing they were undertaking. And I think it was John Adams that made the comment to his wife Abigail. It's like, what, as New England men, what have we seen? In other words, we're not in any way, shape, or form equal to this task. We've not been anywhere. We've not done anything. What have we seen that would make us qualified or competent to do this thing? And so I think they approached it with a large degree of humility, but also with a diligence in their study and their application of what they learned. So it was a profoundly special generation of people. Not perfect, but they were amazing men and women. John Adams would not have been near what he was without Abigail.
That's 100% true. Yeah, sounding board and also an influence on his thinking and the rights of women and everything else. But you mentioned humility, and that's true. It was a combination of humility and understanding the gravity of what they were doing at that moment. Like there was no, amongst the founders, I've never read any one of them that was just kind of oblivious to like how big of a deal this was. Like this was a big deal what they were doing. And that's why a lot of them wrote so many things down. Of course, they couldn't there wasn't any radio at the time or internet or anything, so they had to write things down to communicate and write letters to each other. A lot of them took great efforts to preserve what they were writing because they recognized the gravity and the importance of what they were doing. I mean, they knew, in fact, just by advocating for revolution and pulling away from Great Britain, that they were potentially putting their lives at risk of death. Even before the Revolutionary War itself started, they didn't know how things will play out, but they basically were becoming traitors to the crown in England. So they definitely knew the gravity of it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, humility and sacrificial courage and bravery, because they were willing to risk their whole lives for what they were advocating for. Just again, incredible string of events of how that all played out. It definitely looks to me like God's hand was in it for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, they were clearly aware of the immensity of what they were getting ready to do, as evidenced by their closing words in the Declaration of Independence, where they pledged to each other their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor. So they literally knew that this could cost them everything, to include their lives. Kind of went a little bit afield from the topic, but it's all good. The other thing that Hamilton, his view that I think if he were alive today, if he could come back and read the papers from the last, couple of weeks or months or whatever, he might reframe his opinion on some things, because I think some things have progressed in ways that he could not have anticipated. One of the things that he wrote about where the judiciary is concerned, he was convinced that the judiciary should and could only be the weakest of the three branches of government, because it did not have the power of the sword, did not have the power of the purse. All it had was judgment. And so he thought it would be the weakest and the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution, he wrote. He said, "Whoever attentively considers the different departments of power must perceive that in a government in which they are separated from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution." So I think he would be very surprised at how much power the judiciary wields now. Its ability to step in and declare certain things unconstitutional, to block the executive from doing certain things. I think it wields a lot more power than Hamilton ever thought it would.
Yeah, 100%. It has become just public. Sorry, it has become just public acceptance that whatever the Supreme Court says, that's how it goes. And I understand why, because their job is to interpret the Constitution. They're not supposed to make laws. Throughout its history, you can argue that they did make laws. In their rulings, they're not supposed to. They're only supposed to interpret the Constitution, judge laws based on the Constitution. But sometimes they get it wrong. In fact, I think it's over 180 cases. I need to remember to cite this when we do the editing. Over 180 Supreme Court decisions have been overturned by the Supreme Court. So 180 plus Supreme Court decisions have later been overturned by the Supreme Court. So clearly, the Supreme Court doesn't always get things right.
Yeah. You were talking about activism and sometimes getting it wrong and essentially making laws from the court. Hamilton tried to address that, and he did not view that as being a possibility. He said, "It is not otherwise to be supposed that the Constitution could intend to enable the representatives of the people to substitute their will to that of their constituents. It is far more rational to suppose that the courts were designed to be an intermediate body between the people and the legislature in order, among other things, to keep the latter within the limits assigned to their authority. The interpretation of the law is the proper and peculiar province of the courts. The Constitution is, in fact, and must be regarded by the judges as a fundamental law, therefore belongs to them to ascertain its meaning, as well as the meaning of any particular act proceeding from the legislative body. And I said, in other words, the Constitution ought to be preferred to the statute, the intention of the people to the intention of their agents. And I don't know if you can categorically say that the court fits that description today.
Right.
So very interesting. I saw it here. Oh, he said, back to this idea that the court would necessarily be the weakest branch. He said, this simple view of the matter suggests several important consequences. It proves incontestably that the judiciary is, beyond comparison, the weakest of the three departments of power. One, that it can never attack with success either of the other two. I think he would find that not to be the case nowadays. And that all possible care is requisite to enable it to defend itself against their attacks. Second, and I'm skipping some things here, it proves, in the last place, that as liberty can have nothing to fear from the judiciary alone, but would have everything to fear from its union with either of the other departments. And so I think he would find that interesting as well. That in cases, depending on who you talk to, they will accuse the judiciary of being aligned with the executive, or in some cases they will accuse Congress of trying to weaponize the judiciary by packing the court.
Mm-hmm.
Point being that the thing that Hamilton viewed as being almost harmless, the other two branches have tried incessantly to try to weaponize it. I'll stop there, but it's very interesting, his initial view of it. I think he'd be surprised at the state of affairs.
Yeah.
Hamilton says that from the nature of its functions, the judiciary will be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. He might find that changed as well. The executive not only disposes the honors, but holds the sword of the community. The legislature not only commands the purse, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen are to be regulated. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword or the purse, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of the society, and can take no active resolution whatever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend on the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments.
Interesting. Dependence on the executive arm. Say that again, last line again.
That it has to depend ultimately on the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. In other words, whatever judgments it hands down, it can't enforce it by itself. The executive has to do it.
Interesting. That implies more power to the executive than we interpret today. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's the other way around, right? The executive needs the support of the court if it wants to execute the laws.
Right.
And whenever that tension exists, I think it was probably the view of the founders, the vision of the founders, that if there's some question about some law that Congress has passed, the constitutionality of a law that Congress has passed that the executive is trying to enforce, if the court finds that to be unconstitutional, then go back and clarify, Congress, what you want and bring it within the bounds of the Constitution. And once it is, executive, you're cleared hot to go execute it. But that whole loop is broken right now.
Yeah.
Immigration, I think, we talked about that a little bit last week. I think it's a good example that so many people from a place, I think, of compassion and empathy, they don't want the law as it's written to be enforced. I think over half of the country does want it to be enforced. That was one of the major things of the last election. But even if that weren't the case, the law is the law and should be enforced. And if the majority of the country no longer wants that to be the law, then go back to Congress and change it. Have Congress change it. And now the executive can't enforce a law that the people don't like because that law has been changed.
Right.
But in the meantime, the court shouldn't be able to step in and prevent the executive from executing a law that is on the books and is not in any way contrary to the Constitution. So if the people want something different, there's a way to change it. We just don't do it anymore because it's too hard. And so all three branches test the limits of their purview, and there's a constant tension and struggle, chaos and disorder as a result.
Yeah, that gets to a point that we'll wrap it up with this, tie into what you just said, and it kind of leading into the next episode with focusing on Madison, some of his fears. I think you just said the words that Congress has abdicated, or maybe I imagined it, but that's kind of what you're getting at. The Congress has abdicated its role to hold the executive, basically abdicated its authority to the executive. So like you said, the executive choosing which laws to enforce and how to enforce them is not following the law, as you just said. And if an executive doesn't like how a law is on the books, not enforcing it is effectively breaking the law. So if you don't like it, you go to Congress and try to lobby Congress, compel Congress to change the law, rather than just selectively enforcing it. It's insane to pass a law in the books and think about it just down to your local level. I think we brought this up a couple episodes ago. Just think your local city or town, they pass a law, and then the local government just decides, we're not going to enforce this, or we'll enforce it next week, but not this week. It's crazy. It's a crazy mindset, but we've gotten conditioned to accept it at the national level. So, and that is, I think, too much more power than I think even Hamilton wanted the executive to have. So that gets into a little bit about, how much is too much power, and what was James Madison concerned about the executive having too much power. And that is tied to the legislative branch, Congress, abdicating its authority to the executive, including, Congress could have declared, in all those examples we mentioned, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Congress could have declared war, chose not to. Or they could have voted to whether to declare war or not to declare war in all those conflicts, chose not to, thereby abdicating authority to the executive by choice. And this is what Ron Paul says quite a bit, and Thomas Massey are two that both consistently say that Congress is abdicating authority to the executive in a lot of different ways, both in foreign conflicts as well as the selective enforcement of the laws, things like that. So we'll get into it next week. Were those some of the arguments that James Madison brought up as to fearing an executive that was too powerful? And we'll get into the third episode. We'll kind of talk about, when you combine the two perspectives, how is the level of executive power, effective power today, how has it changed over time, and has it grown over time? And who was more correct as far as Madison's view or Hamilton's view as to how things are playing out today? Who was more right in their concerns? Or is it a blend of both of them? So that's what we'll talk about over the next two episodes. Should be interesting. Again, I've learned a ton just doing a little bit of research, preparing for this episode, and I know I'm going to learn a ton for talking about James Madison next week.
Same for me. And We were talking about Congress abdicating its roles. I think they've abdicated it in two directions. They've abdicated a lot of it to the executive for whatever reason, whether it's to provide themselves plausible deniability and to distance themselves from any bad outcomes, if they support it, or to at least claim that it's being done without my consent, if they disagree with it. And then in the other direction, not regulatory agencies who essentially have the ability, they're unelected people, but they pass regulations that have the force of law. And so Congress has given away too much of its power. And I know there are acts that have been proposed, legislation that have been proposed to try to rein all of that back in, put it back in Congress's lap where it all belongs, because that's the only place that the people can have an effect. People have no way to impact what regulatory agencies do unless they can convince Congress to get involved. And Congress seems happy to let all of these agencies do their jobs. Anyway, totally different topic. But yeah, looking forward to next week talking about James Madison. And then in the week after that, seeing how both his and Hamilton's ideas merged into the government as we know it today, and whether one or the other is borne out as being maybe more correct than the other based on how things have progressed over the last 250 years.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Enjoyed this discussion quite a bit.
Yeah.
Thanks again. It's good to
Yeah,
see
I
you.
did too, man. I learned a lot. Thanks for bringing it up, and forced me into some areas of the Federalist Papers where I haven't been for a while.
Yep, same here.
That was good for me.
It's healthy.
Yeah, for sure. And I hope it inspires other people to pick up a copy of the Federalist Papers and read it.
Yeah.
As I said, you might have to read certain parts of it a couple of times because it's not the way we talk anymore, but it's beautiful. I like it.
You know what I did recently? I took a few of the Federalist Papers just to test it out. I put it in, I think, Grok, and asked it to. I just copied and pasted the Federalist paper into Grok and said, re-articulate this in the style of Ernest Hemingway or in the style of Abraham Lincoln. And it did. And the Ernest Hemingway one
cool.
was extremely blunt. Like what's normally like a 15-word sentence, it was like 3 words because Hemingway was notoriously succinct. So
brief, yeah.
Pretty cool.
That's funny.
Yeah.
That's funny. AI is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at a minimum, if you don't want to read the entire Federalist Papers, have AI summarize it for you or put it in novel form or something.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. It's the whole point behind exhuming Publius, right, is to encourage people to pick up the source documents and try to figure out what the founders really wanted, what their intent was. All of us are guilty, I think, of allowing other people to tell us what these things say and then adopt their opinion of it.
Yeah. And speaking of, thank you for bringing up exhuming Publius a couple of times. I appreciate that. Go to our Substack. So if you're watching this on YouTube or a podcast platform, we have a Substack that has the same podcast episodes on there, video versions. We do video on YouTube, Spotify, and Substack, and Rumble. But the Substack has articles that we've also written as well, and exhuming Publius is one of them that Marcus referenced a few times, and Marcus has a couple on there that are in the same vein, very very well written. So hopefully you like those and can pull the thread a little bit more on some things that we've written about that has to do with the topics we bring up on this podcast.
Yeah, that's been fun, man.
Yeah,
thanks for the topic, and I learned a lot listening to you.
Yeah, likewise, man. Appreciate it always. God bless.
God bless. All right. See you next time.